Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. I trust you had a great weekend. I've been reading a lot this weekend. Found Richard Ford, The Lay of the Land, which is in a trilogy of books actually. The first, one of the first one's a sports writer. I can't remember the name of the second, but it's taking different age brackets, and The Lay of the Land is somebody much older, in his 50s. At the exact moment any decision seems to be being made, it's usually long after the real decision was actually made, like light we see emitted from stars. The next one, life can't be escaped and must be faced entirely. And finally, from another book called Canada, which was excellent, she was an artist. She held opposites in her mind. And then I like this photograph from Tom Lasseter, postcard from Srinagar. It's a place I'd love to visit. It's very evocative, isn't it? Political reflections. American B-52 bomber last week flew within 2 nautical miles of Quarteron Reef in the South China Sea. It is the second US military intrusion within the 12 nautical mile territorial limit surrounding a Chinese-administered islet in the South China Sea. And this is the pivot to Asia baring its fangs again, as it did in December 2013, when I wrote about it. But because it's still not clear to me whether this is some kind of theatre or it's the real thing, because each time there is a lot of ambiguity. Here in this case, the same B-52 might have flown off course. In the previous intrusion, there was a sense that it wasn't a freedom of passage navigation. But, let's see how that is. It remains stressed and stressful. Japan's Prime Minister Abe forges ties with India to counter China. Both countries are viewed by Washington as pillars of its aggressive drive to strategically isolate and encircle China. The so-called pivot to Asia. Long the US's most important Asian ally, Japan has, with Washington's enthusiastic support, recently thrown off the remaining legal and constitutional constraints on the deployment of its military overseas and foreign arms sales. Saying, although India is not a formal US treaty ally, it's now procuring much of its weaponry from the US, is pursuing closer military strategic ties with both Japan and Australia. And I concluded by saying that Japan and India are the triangulators, as it were. India very much sees itself as the premier power in the Indian Ocean, and I think you can see that there is a rapprochement, and I think I spoke about that during the time of the visit. Let me put up a photograph of the B-52. It's not clear whether it was a deliberate intrusion or a mistake. Samir Kantar, Hezbollah leader, was killed in a Damascus rocket strike. Hezbollah Salam Kantar, known in Lebanon as the Dean of Lebanese prisoners, apparently the longest serving prisoner in an Israeli jail. Yesterday's strike was the first assassination inside Syria attributed to Israel since Russia joined air operations in Syria. On the 30th of September, Moshe Yaalon, Israel's defense minister, has said that Russia and Israel have worked out an open communication system to prevent misunderstandings between the two countries. And I concluded by saying Israel is seemingly not deterred by the Russian S-400 missile defense system, which has deterred practically everybody else. I'll put up a photograph of the S-400 system. State television showed footage of Assad and his wife Asma making the visit overnight to the Notre Dame de Damas church and listening to the choir. John Kerry says Assad can stay. Barack Obama says Assad must go. Badra Kumar thinks Israel is the winner in the reconciliation with Turkey. and he mentions that Erdogan is due to visit Saudi Arabia on December the 29th. President Assad is expected to pay a visit to Tehran in the coming days, though fault lines in regional politics are barely hidden. On that note, Turkey has shown the iron fist of the Kurds lately, and this is a photograph I found of a masked protester running for cover from tear gas after throwing a petrol bomb towards Turkish police in Istanbul. This is interesting. The region would be much more stable with Gaddafi, Hussein and Assad in place, Sanders, a Democrat, said on NBC's Meet the Press. 100%. Is there even a doubt in your mind, said Trump in a separate interview on the same show. According to a report in the American Conservative, alienated individuals or very small groups with no overall authority and no orders from self-appointed leaders, but able to terrorize Western populations through occasional seemingly random acts of violence, talking about risks, and saying indeed 100% success in preventing them is no more likely than a comparable rate in preventing murder or armed robbery, talking about the Boston Marathon bombing, and saying lone wolves travel in packs that may be real but are just as likely to be virtual. They resemble gangs or other equivalent communities. And I spoke about this when I said in a world of more than 7 billion souls, the fat tail, those at the very extremity, the people who are prepared to behave like this, those prepared to act for their Warholian moment of fame, is quite a number. Protesters block a road in Wollongombe, this is in Ethiopia. Protesters wrap the two bodies in blankets and plastic sheeting. On top they placed pieces of paper with the names of the dead, alongside the bullet casings from the weapons that had just killed them. Then the chanting began. There is no democracy, there is no justice. This was the scene in Wollongombe, a town in Ethiopia's Oromo region, on Tuesday, shortly after security forces fired into a crowd protesting at plans to develop farmland surrounding the capital, Addis Ababa. At least 4 people were killed. The defiance of protesters from Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, the Oromo, was recorded by one of the activists who filmed the scenes with his mobile phone. "Stop the killing," they shouted. And I'm not so sure an iron fist approach is optimal, given that the Oromo region is home to a third of the country's 95 million people. And I think this is a qualitatively different test than something like the Zone 9 bloggers. Moving on to the currency markets, the euro trading a little bit better at 108.75, dollar index 98.72, Japanese yen 121.35, probably repatriation, which is a trend we see every year at this time of it. Swiss franc 0.9921, the pound 149.16, the Aussie 0.7182, India rupee 66.335, South Korean won 1178.77. The real has softened dramatically, 3.9804, back near that 4 level. Egyptian pound 783.33, and the rand 1507.11. I'm bearish the rand, and I think you sort of sell it any time it pops below 15. Dollar index, let me put up a 1-year chart. I think my target for next year is 110, and I think that's very reasonable. Hedge funds have trimmed their net euro short position by 6.9% to $21.9 billion ahead of that Fed decision. Euro dollar, let me put up a 1-year chart. We're at last at 108.75, and I think, on the chart we might have seen a double bottom. If I remember correctly, we got below 105 in the first big move down to lows in the euro, and then recently we were down before that ECB decision. It was around 105.25, and I think those two levels might turn out to be a double bottom. Dollar Canada last trading at 139.24, and I've been bearish about that all year. I think we might even have traded 140 on Friday, I'm not sure. Commodity markets, gold 1070. I think it will slump into triple digits in 2016. I think a lot of people are probably short around the 1055 level, expecting a sharp drop. They haven't got it, they're being squeezed. Brent futures fell as low as $36.32 in overnight trading, weakest since 2008. Both benchmarks are down more than 2/3 since mid-2014 when the rout began. Put up a one-year chart of WTI crude oil. Holga, Dubai's 10-year default probability jumps to 33% as oil rout continues. On that note, I'll put up a photograph of Dubai in the afternoon. The African Union is proposing sending 5,000 peacekeepers into Burundi. Burundi is rejecting this peacekeeping force. Nkurunziza's spokesman, one of them, Gervais Abayeho, told Al Jazeera on Saturday that Burundi does not need a peacekeeping force. We will not allow foreign troops in Burundi. We don't need them. I spoke about this earlier in the year, in May 2015, when I said eyes on Burundi, spillover risks from debacle loom, and I think we're at that moment when it's beginning to spill over. Willy Nyamitwe, who's the president's spokesman as well, warned the planned deployment of African Union soldiers will be an invasion of the country. So there is not much, but let's see. The AU is prepared to ride roughshod over Burundi. Burundi's government. James Michel won the runoff vote in the Seychelles presidential election after securing 50.2% of votes cast. 193 more votes than his rival. That was a wafer-thin win. And it was interesting because whilst I was at that Afrexim Bank conference, a lot of folks sort of came and talked to me and said it was, you could feel that they were bristling under the control of Michel. And then even more than that time we went on the ferry, we were coming back, what we saw at 6 o'clock in the evening was a society, admittedly young people, but really on the edge. I'll put up a photograph of the beach in the Seychelles. Clinging to power, the African leaders who don't want to stand down. The limit of 2 presidential terms in African constitutions goes back to the late 1990s. It was a lesson drawn from the results of autocratic regimes and presidency for life. But these limits were quickly broken, beginning with Togo in 2002, followed by Chad, Uganda in 2005. Idris Deby and Yoweri Museveni have been in power since 1990 and 1986, respectively. Constitutions in Angola, Djibouti, Cameroon have also been changed to allow incumbents to stay in power, as well as in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe has been president since 1980. The basic tendency in Central Africa over the last few years has not been towards greater democracy, but in the opposite direction. In a recent note, strategic consulting firm Control Risk said it was unlikely the changes in Burkina Faso and Nigeria would bring about others elsewhere in Africa in 2016. Very interesting piece by Verisk Maplecroft, Africa impending sovereign debt crisis to impact investors. Africa's economies are once again facing a sovereign debt crisis in the decade since receiving debt relief from international financial institutions. African governments have increasingly made use of their improved credit worthiness by turning to non-concessional borrowing, especially dollar-denominated bonds, to raise revenues. The funds generated by these bonds were intended for capital investment, primarily in infrastructure. However, poor budget discipline has meant that some countries have used the money to fund public sector salaries, subsidies for basic goods, and interest payments on other loans. Now faced with a commodities downturn, falling revenues and depreciated currencies, these governments are struggling to service their debts. As a result, the prospect of a return to large-scale IMF intervention in Africa is becoming ever greater, especially as the recently announced rise in US interest rates is almost certain to push borrowing costs even higher. Talk about Ghana, having already entered a 3-year extended credit facility arrangement with the IMF, Mozambique waiting for a decision on its application for IMF support, saying a key condition of IMF assistance is large-scale cuts in government spending in order to reduce fiscal deficits. For instance, Ghana's extended credit facility arrangement required spending cuts of around $600 million. It will be virtually eliminated by 2016. Fuel subsidies. saying removal of food and fuel subsidies is therefore highly likely to lead to civil unrest. Important point they're making. The economics of terrorism in Africa, Kofi Ale, very interesting piece there, well worth reading, talking about how terrorism is undermining GDP growth, weighing down on overall economic performance, talking about economic indicators in some countries already being revised downwards. Fight against terrorism is sucking up scarce financial resources, good point. Countries at risk are among the most promising frontier markets. Terrorism is undermining state building. Risk that fighting terrorism poses to civil liberties is especially acute in Africa. Good, I say. It was Zuma's greatest blunder since he assumed the presidency in 2009. That's Africa Confidential. Saying Zuma has lost much of his power to determine the outcome of the presidential succession race between his ex-wife Dlamini Zuma and Ramaphosa, and then giving some background and saying within government and the governing party, however, the centre of gravity has shifted away from the president. The Economist is saying South Africa's democracy, the hollow state. Shortly before Mr. Nene was sacked, he had blocked attempts by Dudu Myeni, the chair of South African Airways, to renegotiate a deal to buy aircraft. Miss Myeni is an ally of Mr. Zuma. Indeed, she is such a close pal that Mr. Zuma's office issued a statement denying that he has a romance and a child with her. Now, it's not clear, and I think people are worried whether in that interregnum between the appointment of Gordhan and the 4 days that Van Rooyen was in there, was anything signed. A lot of people concerned. South African oil share fell 1.99% Friday. It's down 2.12% year to date. Dollar Rand, I'll put up a 6-month chart. I think it's a big sell below 15. The Egyptian EGX30 is down 24.86% year to date. Nigeria's trade balance weakens as oil prices, currency controls bite. The balance of trade in the third quarter was 645 billion naira, down from 2.87 trillion naira in the third quarter a year ago. That's extraordinary. Nigeria's exports fell by 50.3% in the third quarter from a year ago, and imports declined 7.3%, the NBS said. And there you see it in the hardcore data, the policy of squeezing cash out of the system in order to hold the naira. The Nigerian oil share fell to a fresh 36.5-month low. It's down a total of 23.43% this year. Congo plans a debut Eurobond of $1 billion to support growth. You have to be careful, Ponyo said in reference to interest payments on debt. As soon as you sign, the counter starts. Moody's has placed Mozambique's B2 government rating on review for downgrade, saying the deterioration in the external debt of both the government and the whole economy has continued, reaching respectively an estimated 60% and 99% of GDP in 2015. All government external debt is foreign, mostly dollar denominated. As a result of the depreciation of the currency against the dollar, the burden of the government's future external debt payments is increasing. The French distribution group CFAO opened its first shopping mall in Africa on Friday, $66 million centre in Ivory Coast's Abidjan. Air France bomb scare, suspicious device found in toilets was a hoax, as the airline's CEO, Flight 463 from Mauritius, was forced to make an emergency landing in Mombasa after the object was discovered in the toilets of the aircraft, which was carrying 473 people. Frank Gagey, the head of Air France and investigations, revealed the device was made of cardboard, paper, and a household timer. This object did not contain explosives. You put up a photograph that the Daily Record published. Reportedly, the fake bomb found on the Air France plane Flight 463. Make up your own mind on that note. They put up a photograph of Fort Jesus in Mombasa. It took this time last year. Current General reports that full-year profit earnings per share slumped 88.342%. Interestingly, revenue was up 19.649%. They took a gain in the fair value of investment properties of 339 million. Net foreign exchange, they took nearly a 300 million impairment. Um, Profit for the year down 54.323%. Full year EPS down 88.432%. They had warned previously in the accompanying commentary. The company said the year to September proved extremely challenging. The common theme running through various profits warnings has been FX, and car in general was no exception, and I quote, resulted in substantial foreign exchange losses, realized and unrealized, of Kenya shillings 300 million. They skipped a full year dividend. Serious margin compression. My piece for the weekend was the Teflon shilling and other matters. The Kenya shilling closed Friday at 102.31, which is where it is at now, which is just 0.59% below a 16-week intraday high of 101.70. The shilling has been Teflon and has outperformed nearly every currency in the world over this 4-month period. This year, it has been all about the dollars, and investors anticipated the US Federal Reserve's first rate hike since 2006. Exactly 7 years to the day after lowering interest rates to virtually zero, the US Fed raised rates 0.25% last week. The dollar has ground nearly every currency you care to mention into the ground. Commodity-based currencies have taken the biggest hit as the commodity markets unwound a more than a decade-long rally, with some commodity prices now at levels last seen in 2001. Commodity markets have a long-standing inverse correlation with the dollar. Intense volatility, downside price action has engulfed the shilling's sub-Saharan African peers. The rand, for example, has fallen more than twice as much as the shilling versus the dollar this year, and volatility has spun off the charts recently when South Africa's President Jacob Zuma tested his no Zuma limits theory with the appointment of the little-known David Van Rooyen, now reversed. The Zambian kwacha has fallen so far this year that President Edgar Lungu embraced prayer rallies, which is best characterized as unorthodox economic policy making. The Mozambique Metical has retreated about 3.6 times more than the shilling. When you place the shilling against this context and backdrop, its recent performance is nothing short of remarkable. This is considering that the government commercial lending rates, however, lagging big time. Government interest rates have largely normalized now after the late October swoon when one-year Treasury bills reached 22.36%. At the last auction, one-year bills were sold at 12.48%. Interbank rate was last at 4.7726%. The shilling has been seriously resilient at a time when the interest rate prop has dived. Naysayers in commentary and research indicate they have been in a majority, have surely been looking for a move to 110 by now. It is not going to happen, and I am in fact looking for a move into double digits in the first quarter 2016. What's going on, you might well ask? Well, oil accounts for about a quarter of Kenya's annual import bill. According to latest data, Kenya imported 177.2 billion shillings worth of fuel and lubricants between January and September, a 34.66% drop from 271.2 billion it took in during the same period last year. That's a 94 billion shilling swing and nearly $1 billion. That's $1 billion of dollar demand that has evaporated. Since September, the price of fuel has tanked more than 20%, further accelerating this trend. Earlier in the year, I spoke of how this $1 billion boost would underpin our economy by providing a powerful grassroots stimulus. However, what has happened is that the government has creamed off a great deal of this by raising taxes on the price of fuel and thereby improving its fiscal position, and this has blunted the price move at the pump. Other factors that are supporting the shilling are the bona fides of the central bank, and the regime change at the Apex Bank has been extremely well received by the markets. The political hullabaloo around the Eurobond is now being discounted because no one in fact believes there was a 140 billion shilling heist. The IMF downgraded their GDP forecast for 2015 to 5.6% from a previously seriously highball prediction of 6.5%. I think 5.6% looks too high, but consider that our rate of expansion is nearly 2% ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. I appreciate it's been tough on the ground, but if interest rates can now normalize at lower levels and in line with government interest rates, if the anti-corruption drive continues to gain traction and can staunch some of the hemorrhaging, then the trend might well positively surprise. Nairobi all shares down 10.65% this year, the NSE 20 is down 21.96% and back below 5,000. If you want to check any share price, the link is the final item on Rich Wrap-Ups. Once again, I appreciate you stopping by.